Good morning. It's Friday, May 9th. The multi-front war in the Middle East is now 581 days old. I'm your host, Jonathan Schanzer. Welcome back yet again to the FDD Morning Brief. Well, it looks like the U.S. has proposed a new Gaza aid mechanism, and Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth has canceled a trip to Israel. These are the few of the top headlines, but I'm still working to understand the meaning of that deal cut between the Trump administration and the Houthis. I believe U.S. Ambassador to Israel, Mike Huckabee, has cleared it all up for us. He said that the U.S. is not required to get permission from Israel to get the Houthis to stop attacking our ships. And he further clarified that America shouldn't be required to respond if Israel sustains Houthi attacks. From an America First perspective, that all makes sense. But it does beg the question, are the Trump administration and Israel working from the same playbook on shared threats? We're keeping a close eye on all of that. Today's guest is Behnam Ben Taleblu, Senior Director of FDD's Iran program. Behnam leverages his Persian language skills to track everything from the regime's nuclear program to its regional terror proxies and more. The notorious BBT will be joining us today to help break down what's at stake ahead of round 4 of the U.S.-Iran nuclear talks this Sunday in Oman. So grab your coffee now. Our conversation is coming your way in just a few short minutes. Uncertainty surrounds 3 of the 24 hostages held by Hamas in the Gaza Strip, previously believed to be alive. On Wednesday, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu cast doubt on the fate of the 3 hostages. That came after comments from his wife, Sarah, followed by similar comments by President Donald Trump, who stated that the number of living hostages was likely 21, not 24. First, let me say the fate of every hostage is on the mind of all Israelis I know. This is not the time for the Israeli government to withhold information or for officials to inject more anxiety into an extremely stressful ordeal. It's even more stressful when foreign leaders start dropping news about the hostages that wasn't cleared for release. Bibi eventually confirmed that 1 Israeli and 2 foreign nationals are among those feared lost. The mother of Tamir Nimrod, a soldier kidnapped from his army base on October 7th, publicly revealed that her son may be gone. 2 foreign workers from Nepal and Thailand are also thought to be dead. Amidst all the dizzying headlines coming out of the region, from Iranian nuclear talks to the Houthis, Hezbollah, and Syria, it's important to remember the hostages are a big reason for this war. There's a real chance this war could be immediately ended if those hostages were returned. It could go a long way toward healing the nation of Israel and perhaps put the region on an alternative trajectory. Massive pressure on Hamas and its patrons, Iran, Qatar, and Turkey, is still urgently needed. Now for your headlines. Headline 1, the U.S. dropped the demand for normalization with Israel as a condition for advancing civil nuclear cooperation discussions with Saudi Arabia. Well, that's a plot twist. Under the first Trump administration, big deals were brewing with Saudi Arabia, and they were all linked to normalization. That fell apart when Trump lost the election. Under the Biden administration, traction for normalization evaporated almost overnight as Biden alienated the Saudis for the first half of his term. By the second half, however, things were mostly back on track. Nuclear talks were tied to expanding the Abraham Accords through a Saudi-Israel peace deal. Now that deal is apparently on ice. What happened? The war happened. Some people say that Hamas and its patrons in Iran launched the war to sabotage Israel's normalization with the Arab world. I'm not sure I buy that. I think the war was driven by good old-fashioned hatred for Israel, and that hatred was reawakened in some of the Arab countries around the region. I still think normalization is possible, but I also think that will happen only after Israel defeats Iran on the battlefield or some other dramatic event reminds the region that Israel is still the strong horse. Headline 2, a mob at Columbia University disseminated pamphlets praising a Palestinian terrorist. There's a reason why people call Columbia Birzeit on the Hudson. The scene was a familiar one. Masked anti-Israeli agitators stormed Columbia's library and handed out flyers glorifying Bassel al-Araj, a Palestinian terrorist who plotted attacks on Israeli civilians. Footage obtained by the New York Post shows chaos, drums pounding, Palestinian flags flying, property defaced, 2 school safety officers injured in the scuttle. I'm pretty sure the students got extra credit from some of their radical professors for this stuff, if they were students at all, that is. This comes after a dramatic hearing here in Washington. The presidents of DePaul, Haverford, and Cal Poly testified Wednesday before the House Education and Workforce Committee. The Haverford president botched that hearing in a huge way, and it all continues to be very clarifying for me. But I also think that these idiotic administrators are only part of the story. It's time for a full hearing on the influence of Qatari sovereign wealth in higher ed. You've heard me sound off on the Qatari threat to our education system more than a few times, but it's for good reason. It's a huge story, massive amounts of money, and that's not getting enough attention. And headline 3, speaking of Qatar, Israel's Qatargate scandal has gotten even messier. To recap, Qatargate is the name of the debacle rocking Israel's political elite. The allegations continue to swirl about top Netanyahu aides accepting Qatari cash in exchange for pushing Doha's agenda in the Israeli media. Qatar is not an official enemy nation in the eyes of Israeli law, but everyone knows they are patrons of Hamas and a whole menagerie of other terror groups. As they'd say in Israel, this is one giant balagan. The latest Bibi advisor, Yonatan Urich, was hauled in Wednesday for more questioning just as his house arrest was wrapping up. He was promptly given another 24 hours of detention. And now Israeli media report that 2 former senior Mossad officials are involved. Yep, Qatar's reach went straight into the heart of Israel's security elite. A friendly reminder for Washington, Israel's mess should be a wake-up call. There's a lot to uncover in this town, and when the wheels start to come off, it will be just as ugly as Qatargate, if not worse. All right. It's time for that conversation with Behnam Ben Taleblu from FDD's Iran program. The notorious BBT will help us break down everything from nuclear talks to Tehran's internal politics. So let's do this. Welcome to the program, BBT.
Great to be with you, John. Good morning.
All right. Good morning. Let's start with this question. Probably no surprise. This Sunday, May 11th, is the next round of the nuclear talks in Oman. What is happening and what do we expect?
Well, never say never, because the Iranian media has still been using the word likely, and we haven't even had a full U.S. confirmation yet. And there was supposed to be a previous round 4 in Rome on the first weekend in May, on May 3rd. The U.S. ended up pushing away from the table on that, citing logistical issues, later on saying that they never confirmed at the end of round 3 that that would be the date for round 4. The Iranian media now is saying that Arafchi will be traveling, meaning Iran's foreign minister will be traveling to Saudi Arabia and Doha. They did not officially mention Oman yet, but again, they said likely. In the case that the talks do happen, given that the president will be traveling to the Middle East next week as well, so you may have a flurry of U.S. advisors heading out there this weekend, the Iranians are looking to do 2 or 3 things with respect to this round. One is to establish, based on what has been reported, their ability to float an interim proposal that would buy time, that would basically surpass what the president had offered before, which was a 2-month deadline to reach a nuclear deal. Increasingly, the more the Iranians come to the table and stay at the table, the less real that 2-month deadline the president had offered is looking. That's not necessarily a good thing when it comes to U.S. credibility. The second is to have the Iranian presence at the negotiating table blunt the administration's maximum pressure campaign. So far, presidential statements seem to be having something of a tertiary effect on the Iranian economy, stabilizing the rial a little bit on the sidelines, but there still are a whole host of illicit buyers of Iranian oil, but that hasn't stopped the administration from going after China. There was just a major refinery sanctions package by Treasury this weekend. And third, the Iranians are hoping that simply still by showing up, they can create more coordination problems between the Americans and the Israelis, because they believe so long as Trump is talking, Bibi is not shooting.
And I think that's probably good calculus on their part. Let's talk about that rhetoric from the Trump team. We've watched the messaging change and then change again, and it's sometimes hard to follow. What do you think, as of right now, what is the U.S. position?
Well, I think the U.S. position is politically clear, but technically still murky, but moving towards clear. So politically, I think the president has laid down a pretty strong marker that he does not want the Islamic Republic of Iran to have a nuclear weapon. That's more of a political statement, I believe, than a technical statement. He's let his advisors, his staff, his personnel fill that in with how best to pursue that policy, how best to achieve that outcome. But I don't think the president himself is negotiating in plain sight. The only divergence the president has put out there is that you can end your nuclear program or not have a nuclear weapon through a negotiation, or there will be a military conflict. Everything else, I think, is still up in the air. I think the president actually cultivates uncertainty and doubt to a certain degree. He can weaponize it. But the problem is when your allies don't even know the path that you're pursuing to achieve that end state, you're not going to be in the best position with respect to your adversaries as well. And I would recommend that the administration actually take a page from the Iranian playbook here, who, despite engaging in whoever you believe, direct or indirect nuclear negotiations, the Iranians are also coordinating with the Russians separately, with the Chinese separately. They've had about 6 rounds of conversations with the Europeans as well. So they've reconstituted the P5+1, but on their terms. So whatever pathway the Americans are taking, it increasingly looks like it's moving towards dismantlement or disarmament, if you're paying attention to what President Trump has been saying. Again, I think in Trump term 2, you have to pay more attention to the president than his advisors. That pathway seems to be moving forward, but it really does need to be shared and socialized, 1, with U.S. partners in the region, and 2, with other friendly members of the P5+1, and I haven't necessarily seen that yet.
All right, now let's talk about that, the rhetoric coming out of the regime. The regime is weak, especially considering its proxies and air defenses both got pretty shellacked by the Israelis over the last year and a half. So why is it not negotiating like it's weak? I mean, the regime, right? I mean, it is probably the leverage that we have, that the Israelis have over the regime, would suggest that maybe they would capitulate. Maybe they would roll over on some of the demands. Why do you think we're not seeing that reflected in the Iranian negotiating position?
Well, before we hop into the Iranian position, I want to say I'm still a little shocked that the administration has not taken a victory lap this early. And I mean that because all throughout Trump term 1, the Iranians refused to even negotiate. They refused even all the indirect sources of mediation. You remember Angela Merkel, Prime Minister Shinzo Abe. There was a whole host of people auditioning to be a bridge between the Americans and the Iranians. And even after President Trump left office, the Iranians said that Qasem Soleimani's shoe, that was the chief terrorist the Americans had killed in January 2020, was worth more than his assassin's head. So Qasem Soleimani's shoe was worth more than Trump's head. And even as early as 2025, Iranian Supreme Leader said that there was no utility or no value in negotiating with the Americans. But the Iranians had done an about-face because of what they saw barreling back towards them, which was maximum pressure by a person who in a year and a half in term 1 had done more macroeconomic damage unilaterally than about a decade and a half of multilateral sanctions in previous administrations. So the Trump administration should really, in my view, to bolster their position at the negotiating table, should really have taken the victory lap of saying, we have just compelled, we have just forced the Iranians to the negotiating table. It's a little odd they didn't say that. And I think that permitted the Iranians to do what they do best, which is often enter negotiations with a weak hand, and then simply through stylistic means leave negotiations with a strong hand. Right now, they're making the Americans, which are the superpower, look like, because they politically want a deal, look like, at least in the public sources and the press and whatnot, look like a supplicant. That is a big problem. If the Iranians are able to, forgive me, enact the bazaar mentality and charge you something that is an exorbitantly high price because they know you want something from them. In Persian, we say it's like you're charging your father's blood money.
Okay, so all right, with Tehran's, I guess they're fronting like they've got more power at the negotiating table, but they also, I mean, let's just talk about what we're watching regionally. Their ring of fire strategy is significantly undermined, right? I mean, we look around and I mean, Hezbollah is significantly weaker than it was. The Syrian front has collapsed. Hamas is, I mean, I think we get a sense it's on its last leg. The Houthis have just been pounded by the Americans, by the Israelis. So that entire ring of fire strategy has been undermined. So What do we think the regime has been thinking about in terms of this ongoing proxy war with Israel? They're not done fighting the Israelis. That's clear to me. So what does this evolving approach look like in your mind?
Well, with both the nuclear program as well as their military endeavors, as well as the export of the revolution and the rehab of this constellation of terror proxies that they call the axis of resistance, everything right now with the Islamic Republic is a game of high risk, high reward. By escalating so far on the nuclear program, they're trying to get leverage. And actually, when you're looking in the region, by trying to have these deconfliction or ceasefire agreements, first you saw last year with respect to Lebanon, Hezbollah there. Now you're seeing very recently this potential U.S. Houthi ceasefire in Yemen and with respect to the Red Sea that leaves Israel out of it, but that allegedly says that the Houthis won't be firing on American military ships or commercial vessels traversing the Red Sea. The Iranians are trying to do two things: to create political space that removes the most urgent source of fire against their proxies, and that locks in their proxies in these war zones and prevents a military solution from destroying them. So Hezbollah is down, but it's not out. The Houthis have taken 51, 52 consecutive days of U.S. airstrikes in Yemen, and to prevent that from doing more damage than already caused, they've reportedly pushed for this ceasefire option. So they're trying to throw a diplomatic card out there to bail out this proxy, to prevent it from getting militarily destroyed, and then use the time during the ceasefire, just like the Iranians used the time during the Saudi Houthi ceasefire in 2022 and 2023, to rehab these organizations, to give them new long-range strike capabilities, and then to be able to turn on and turn off the cycle of violence, be it against America, be it against Israel, be it potentially against any other Arab partner in the Middle East at a time of their own choosing. So the high risk, high reward strategy is by giving the little bits, they hope to get a lot. By turning weakness into a sign of goodwill, they can actually get America to disconnect the dots between patron and proxy. Because if you remember, both President Trump as well as Secretary of Defense Hegseth had tweeted that they would hold the Houthis accountable. They would hold the Iranians accountable for any Houthi strikes. We haven't necessarily seen that connect the dots between patron and proxy. And I think the Islamic Republic is looking to press upon this to bail out its proxies, make sure they can live to fight another day, and in the interim have this weakness be misread as goodwill.
I think you're right. All right, I want to broaden out. We talk about it all the time on this show. The Iranian people need our help to bring down their regime. We talk about it a lot at FDD about how this is the right strategy, maybe the only real strategy that will work at the end of the day, that a lot of the other stuff that we talk about will be tactical or fleeting. So I guess the question here is, will the Trump administration provide that help if a deal is cut? What is the status of that maximum support strategy that you and our other FDD colleagues embrace?
And our other friends of FDD across Washington, like Nufti, for example. But here's what I'll tell you as Senior Director of the Iran program: deal or no deal, war or no war, we will still be pursuing the best possible approach for U.S. policy, or advocating for and calling for the best possible approach, which is a combination of maximum pressure on the regime and maximum support for the Iranian people. Just recently, as you know, there was that bill introduced in Congress the other month, or earlier in the month of April, about maximum support for the Iranian people. There's cyber stuff there, there's tech stuff there, there's democracy assistance, there's VPN stuff to make sure Iranians can access the internet. This stuff is foundational, both in terms of U.S. strategy as well as in terms of U.S. values. Now, at the moment, just like any time you have nuclear talks with a government like the Islamic Republic become part and parcel of U.S. policy, it takes up all the oxygen in the room. This was the case during the Biden administration, and this was most certainly the case during the Obama administration back in the day. You know, we saw this at the front lines at FDD back in Washington, 2013 to 2015. Now I think the Trump administration is, again, roped into that process. But by having congressmen, senators, the media, other think tankers continuously show the president that there is another option here, that everything you are doing is at best a management exercise rather than a solution to a regime which has quite literally been trying to kill you, we will forever be in this kind of secondary catch everything and responsive and reactive framing. So maximum support is something that we are very passionate about at FDD. It's something that we hope to continue to socialize. It's something that I think the president himself would be able to really push forward, given his really good policy with respect to the Iranian street, which was protesting en masse against the Iranian state all throughout term one. Both the rhetoric and the reality of the Trump term two administration leave something to be desired, especially when you're comparing it to that term one track record. But that doesn't mean we're going to take a backseat, and that doesn't mean we're going to be stopping calling for the importance of this linkage of maximum pressure on the regime and maximum support for the people. So perhaps Congress will be taking the lead on this in the short term. But talks or no talks, deal or no deal, war or no war, it's all about being able to see who are the most pro-American forces, who are the most pro-American voices in the Middle East, and standing with them. Because in my view, that is doing well by the U.S. national interest.
It is. And of course, we know that the Iranian people tend to lean that way, which is exactly why we need to embrace this. All right, we're going to leave it there. I want to thank you, BBT, for joining us today on the FDD Morning Brief.
Thank you so much.
All right, here's what FDD has on tap for you today. My colleague Seth Frantzman has a new piece in the National Interest examining whether Syria's regime can and will protect minority groups like the Druze and the Alawites. He argues that Damascus must learn from recent sectarian violence and act quickly to prevent further bloodshed. This just is not about preserving domestic stability. It's about building trust with Western and anti-Assad states that have signaled tacit support for the new Syria. And by the way, we are hearing about Israeli talks with the Syrian government. That's been happening. And I think a lot of that is centered around the way that the Druze are being handled, as well as whatever's happening in that southern buffer zone. FDD just released a new monograph on the Houthis, the Yemen-based Iran-backed terrorist group destabilizing the region. It's written by an Israeli analyst named Ari Heistein, and it has a foreword written by your humble host here at the FDD Morning Brief. The report tracks the ascent of the Houthis and then lays out what the U.S. can do to blunt future attacks on Red Sea shipping and beyond. Obviously, this was all written before the ceasefire, but we don't know how long that ceasefire is going to last. I suspect the Houthis are going to raise their arms up again and start fighting. Finally, have a listen to new episodes of the Iran Breakdown, FDD's podcast, hosted by CEO Mark Dubowitz. One does a deep dive on the nuclear talks with Israeli journalist Barak Ravid, and the other breaks down that network of Iranian terror proxies with FDD experts like Mark Montgomery and Bill Roggio. Both episodes are well worth adding to your podcast queue. Stick a fork in it, folks, because we're done. If you're craving more smart things to read, check out the expert analysis on our website, fdd.org, or take a scroll through our content at X, Instagram, and YouTube. And please do support our work with a generous tax-deductible donation at fdd.org/invest. Tune in Monday for another episode of the FDD Morning Brief. It'll be riveting. I'll be joined by Andrew Galili, a senior policy analyst at the National Union for Democracy in Iran, otherwise known as NUFTI. He'll help us unpack those Iran nuclear talks that are slated to happen this Sunday. We'll be watching carefully. Enjoy your weekend. Oh, and don't forget to call your mom on Sunday because it's Mother's Day. With that, I'm Jonathan Schanzer, signing off for FDD.